Hey, it's Todd Daniele, and today I'm going to be in 3D Studio Max 2024, and I'm going to be using the new array modifier and showing off some of the ways that we can exploit the power of that tool. So why would we use array? Well, in this circumstance, we're going to make a building, and specifically a building with ornate detail. So if you had to make a skyscraper or a simple square apartment building, something like that, you could easily make a box, do some insets and some extrusions, some negative extrusions, and come up with something that you could populate a scene with really quickly. But the problem arises when you need something that has maybe curved windows, like what I'm showing here in the viewport, some details that wouldn't be traditionally found on like a more modern building. So this is going to just really automate the process and make a really highly editable sort of mesh that you can even make variations of and build upon. So the nice thing is that like we can see this window I have here. You have the ability to even level up the detail more than this if you needed to. So, and it will all be parametric. You'll be able to edit it and populate it and update it and art direct it. So it's important to work smart and be able to show this stuff to whoever you may be answering to at a job and have the ability to just quickly update and change things. And the good thing is that the array modifier is going to do a lot of the heavy lifting. So the important thing I want to say is that today what I'm showing you is just using included tools found in 3D Studio Max. There are scripts and plugins that are both free and paid that will generate buildings, and sure, you can use them, and I don't think that they're bad, and they probably be quicker even than what I'm showing you. But having this ability to know that you can use the array modifier and leverage it, and maybe you're not making buildings, maybe you're making a planet or something different shaped, but you can make variations really quickly. So I think it's worth the time to watch what I'm going to show you today just to see how it works. Before I get into the blocking out, I'm going to just show you a couple things. So I have a basic, this blue mesh is a building that I set up, and just to talk briefly about how we're going to set things up, I pretty much found an arched window that like on a website and found the dimensions to be like 5 feet by 30 inches. And I used that as my base. And then what I did was decide I wanted to fit these within a tileable sort of feeling mesh. And I said, all right, well, we're going to go 9 feet tall. So each floor is 9 feet. And across here, I don't remember exact dimension, probably like 60 inches-ish. So the important thing is that whatever we build and use to populate this, we want it to match up with the size of these polygons. So it's important on the front end to be very conscientious of what you're doing and how you're doing it. You can edit this on the fly later, but I think if you do the work at the front end, it'll save you time later on. So it's worth putting time and effort, especially when it's pretty simple. So before we start, I'm just going to show you what's going to happen here with the array modifier. So we have that building. We have these two variations of windows. This is the one I'm going to build first today. A big stack on it right there. That's what we're going to see in this tutorial. And then if I turn on array, you can see, let me just hide the building. It shows you, what I have. There are some gaps here you need to tidy up a little bit. Let me put this in a different mode just so we could see a little cleaner around artifacts. So that's one particular building, like the blocking out, and fully updatable. I'll show you that as well. And then if we go back and just select this and turn off the array and I come back to the other window, it's using that same blue mesh as a basis. And you can see I built that out of the same mesh, just applying array to a different mesh. So the last thing I want to show is that this configuration of this building, the blue mesh, is also very much an editable live kind of asset. So right now we have this shape. You can see I have a symmetry here. I'm going to turn it on. And in a second, we've created a building with a little courtyard and some detail. And pretty much I would say you could take this, build a first floor with an entry and stack up these floors above, and you'd have something really cool. Let me turn off the symmetry briefly. And the last thing I'll show is if we do a border selection on this, I don't recommend doing it this way, but you can. If I just shift and drag this up, once I get to the point where we have the right distance, we'll have a new floor of those windows. So we can add floors simply by doing that. You have to be particular about where they overlap and things like that, but you can see that it's editable and it works really well. So that's the takeaway. We're going to build this. We're going to show you how this works. We're going to show you some options, and that's today's tutorial. So without any further hesitation, let's jump into it. So from that intro piece, I had this base mesh, which is what I have right here. And again, I did like a 9-foot tall floor by roughly, it's like 6 to 7 feet. You can use whatever dimension. And if you have reference or provided blueprints or whatever, you'll match those. I'm just showing you the technique. So what we want to do is be sure that whatever size we build our tileable asset, our array mesh to, fits within the confines of 1 square. And then also, if you do extrusions or pull out faces, you want to make sure that you're in the ballpark of that size. So it might be a good idea to make a single polygon, like a measuring device that you can adjust things from the side. I'll show that later on, or show how to adjust. So what we're going to do is go to front viewport for now. And you can see this is the square that I was just referring to, and we're going to make a window. So not just a square window, we're going to use splines today. We're going to use some older, like not so common tools today as well. I think I said that the window should be like 30 inches wide. So we'll see we have 58.86 centimeters. I showed this in a couple tutorials earlier where you can type in whatever units you want. So I'm going to just type in 30 and then inch and then hit enter. And there's my 30-inch window. So, well, the beginning of my 30-inch window. So now what I want to do is just shift this up and convert this to an editable spline. And I think I showed in my hard surface tutorial that you can now shift drag the splines, and it's pretty cool. So I'm going to just shift drag this to, I don't know, roughly there, and say that's good. Okay, and now what I want to do is get this middle vertex. I'm going to select it and delete it, and these two I'm going to select, right click, and turn them to corner, and that quickly I have the beginnings of the profile of what I want my window to look like. Okay, so I'm going to just tweak it and move it over, center it a little bit better, like that. And now what we're going to do is I'm going to pull it forward so I could see a little better. Okay, and now what I want to do is clone it. So I'm going to hit R for scale, hold shift, scale it. You can see I'm in setting, say OK for a copy, and grab these two verts, which are still selected from the last action, and just make it an adjustment so that the gap between these two splines is pretty consistent. And then the next thing I want to do is grab that spline and shift it back a little bit so we have like a little recessed cove for the window. Okay, so that's the base. Okay, so we have the two splines, and what we want to do is attach them together, make them one piece even though they're separate. And then we're going to hit C and use the cross-section modifier. And you can see it added some lines. Those are cross sections. I'm going to move this forward a little more. And there's no surface. There's just like a network of splines that can make a surface. So the next thing we need is a surface modifier. And we'll hit surface. And you can see, I'm going to go into actually standard mode just so we see some color. There it is. It's extruded. It's kind of kicked back the way I modeled it. But what the problem is the normal's the wrong way. So I'm going to flip the normals, and you can see it now. And I'm happy with that. So now I'm going to just put an edit poly above so I could see what the actual mesh that's generated looks like. And it doesn't look bad. It's a little dense as far as looping, but if we look, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 at the bottom. And then if we come above this horizontal line right here, where the arch starts, and we count these, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So we have double the amount on the top. And the reason we have to take note of that count is because we need to make them so that they are tileable. If we decide to sew everything up later, we'll have the same number of edges to do that with. So this edit poly I'm adding, I'm going to just rename it and call it loop reduction. Just call them something you're in the stack, call these something that you can relate to and understand what you did there. So I'm going to come in here and control double click on these. I'm going to leave these two edges as supports. Even though I'm not going to subdivide this mesh, I'm just going to leave these for now. I don't feel there's any harm in leaving them. Okay, so that's the first step in creating the window. And now each subsequent step, we're going to add an edit poly modifier and just label it and add to the detail of this window. So edit poly, we're going to call this one depth, and we're going to extrude some of these edges. So I'm going to go to border. I'm going to grab the border of the inner face, like the inner selection, and just hold shift, kick that back to make a little recess where the window will sit back from the front surface. It adds some nice detail. And then what I want to do is, with border still selected, select the outer border and come here to selection. I'm going to control and click on edge. And what I want to do is deselect everything except for the bottom loop of edges. And we can see right now I have 6. Okay, so we're going to just shift and drag that down. That's going to be the depth of our sill and just a little bit extra. And the reason I'm doing extra is because if we want to sew it up later and the sill were an extrusion, we'd have issues where every time we had to sew something, we'd have to select those edges manually and it just wouldn't work well. So there is a method to the madness. The next thing we're going to do is, because the top has 12 spans and the bottom has 6, I'm just going to select some edges here, these 6, and then I'm going to hit Alt and R to ring select and Control Shift and E to insert one loop. So now if I double click, I have 12 at the bottom. We'll do a border selection again. Same thing as before, Control click on edge. I'm going to deselect everything below these horizontal lines that come before the arch, and I should have the same count of 12 edges, which I do. And now with W for move, I'm going to shift and drag this up. And then if I come here to the make planar, I'm going to make planar on the Y, and that just gives me a nice squared off section there. And now I'm going to go to front viewport and just see where I'm living as far as matching up to the outer edges of the blue mesh. So I'm going to actually bring this down pretty close to the arch, shift and drag it up to there. And then the bottom edge here, I'm going to also shift and drag down to the bottom edge of the blue. I'm not snapping, but I'm coming close. When you do this yourself, I would suggest planning to be a little more controlled with what you're doing, but I'm trying to get this done relatively quickly. So now I'm just selecting the top edges. I'm going to select all of these edges, subtract everything except for the vertical edges on one side. So there we go. And my edge count seems to be 15. I'm going to go to the front viewport. Oh, see, I got some extras. Get rid of those. My edge selection is now 10 selected edges. I'm going to shift and drag those to the outer extent of where the blue is in the background. You can see it. And I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. I'm going to deselect anything I don't need. And hopefully the edge count matches up. 10, which is what we had before. So we're going to just drag that out to the extent. And there we have the window fitting within one square. So what we're going to do next is start to add some detail. Now what we're going to do is add a crown and a sill. And I'm going to show you a reference image of an old French building that I found. It's from Alame. It's not my image. I'm just using it as a reference. But we can see that there's like a crown and there's a sill. These are really detailed. We're not going to get that crazy with the detail today, but you can see that that's an architectural detail we want. And keep in mind that when I'm done with the tutorial, you can later always bring these meshes that I'm going to create for the crown and the sill out to ZBrush or even within Max using Booleans, however you want to approach it. Make a detailed version and be able to populate your buildings with a more detailed version. So that's the flexibility of the modifier we're using. So what we're going to do, initially I was going to suggest, I'm going to make an edit poly. Initially, I was going to suggest that we do extrusions for these. I'm going to just call this sill crown. And I'll show you that, but I think what I'm going to opt for is a different approach. So we're going to just pivot to a different, I think a better way of doing this, and I'll show you why. So if we go to polygon, we can actually drag this edge down a little bit, because now the sill seems a little petite. I want it to be a little bigger than it was. I'm going to hold shift and just drag across, left click, drag across. I got that selection. And we could simply do this. And then we have a sill, right? That's fine for something square like this. I'm going to undo that. But up here, if we want a crown, it's kind of interesting. We could do a straight crown like this, but I haven't really seen many buildings that have that kind of detail. Usually there would be like an arch or some kind of detail like this. And we could do it with this mesh, but there might be problems here where we have like a pointy kind of surface. So that's why I would say, think about it before you make it, and we're going to do something different. Okay, so what I want to do now is, opposed to extruding, is create what I would, like in gaming they call it a floater. So we're going to make a separate mesh and make that be part of this, this model. So I'm going to go to box and turn on auto grid. I'm going to go to front viewport, and right here I'm going to actually go a little, if I were extruding we'd be locked to the corners here. Because we're floating this, I'm going to just pull out a box that goes a little beyond the edges, and then extrude it a little, and go to perspective to see what I got. I don't really know how far anything went. As you can see, it went negatively. So we're going to just bring it out this way. We're going to reduce these polygon counts. Okay, good example. It's fine. So I'm going to keep that as is, and then go back to front viewport, and we can do a couple things. We can make a square and cut in some detail, or we can make an arched version of this cap that we're going to make. So maybe we'll do that. So the approach I'm going to use to do the arch, I could do what I did before to make the window, but right now I'm just going to vary it up a little bit. I'm just going to make a cylinder. So I'm going to go to front viewport, and just on like this flat surface, I'm going to try to be in the middle, drag something out that looks a little bit bigger than my window, give it a little depth. I'm not worried about all the detail as far as how thick and everything like that, but I do want this sides count by default may not be set to 24. I want it to 24, and the reason being that the top of the arch is 12 segments. We remember that earlier, and I want like things to be reflective of the counts. In case we ever have to add detail, the segmentation would be very similar. So what I'm doing now is just moving this into a certain position so it looks the way I want it to, and it does. And I'm going to just convert this now to an edit poly, and we'll come in here and get this polygon. I'm going to hit R. I'm going to shift and drag with R, and then I'm going to hit W and shift and drag through the back side of the mesh, which is beautiful on Max. It does this nice thing now where it cuts through to the other side of the mesh, and that's just what I wanted to do. And the next thing I'm going to do is add a slice modifier, and we want it not on the Z, we want it on Y, and I'm going to say remove the negative, and that's perfect. And last thing I'm going to do is add a cap holes modifier, and just have that cap the bottom holes there. So that's good. I'm going to put an edit poly above, and maybe just slightly scale this up so that it matches. You can see it's a little inset from the edges there. So I'm going to just do that. That looks good to me. And we can chamfer this and do whatever we want to it at this point. Right now, we'll add a little more detail, but it's always editable later on. So I'm going to select one edge. I'm going to Alt and R to ring select that edge. And then what I want to do is go to connect and say 2. I'm going to use this control right here, which is a pinch, and just make something like that. Say OK. And now what I'll do is go to polygon, deselect because I have some selection still, hold shift, and I'm going to just quickly go across the top here. And also now I'm going to control, I release the mouse button, I'm completely released. I'm going to hit control, then I'm going to hold shift, select the second polygon, and zip across here. Got to be very careful, you can pivot the way I'm pivoting. Okay, and then what I'm going to do is just W and pull that out a little bit. And I'm going to say that's okay as far as detail for this. We get the idea. You can go as crazy as you'd like to, or you can update this later. So there we have the sill and the crown. And what we need to do now is go back to the base. And before I attach them, I have that layer there. I'm going to actually make the array. and we'll talk about the array right now. So you see I added the array, and what it did was make a linear array of this window opening as it is right now. And it's on grid and relative offset, and obviously that's not working for what we want. So under options, we have surface. And then we can pick a surface. I'm going to pick the blue mesh, and you can see it's sort of what we want, but not exactly. So we want to actually go from vertex to face center. And now you can see where the power is coming in of this modifier. It's actually making these snap to that mesh and fit within one square space, which is what we wanted. And they're fully editable still, so we can move them, update this detail, and that's what we're going to do now. So I wanted to just show you that so you could see that we have that mesh of the window, and now we have this sill crown. And if I go and attach these two and turn on the array, every single one of them is updated, and that's very powerful. I will say also, I'm not going to do it right now. You could chamfer those two prior to attaching and collapse it down, and you'd have a nice little chamfer detail if you were getting close to this. Just keep that in mind. I'm not going to do every particular detail of what you can do. Be open-minded, make your decisions based on what you need. So with that, we have the sill and the crown. We need to make a window frame. So I'm going to turn off the array again, and we're going to make a window frame. For the window frame, we'll make a new edit poly. We'll name it frame. And there's a couple things we can do. I'm going to isolate this Alt and Q. You could, well, let me just do it. I'm going to go polygon selection, deselect because I have some polygons selected. Hold on, I'm going to just control double click, get those faces, okay? And now what I want to do is shift and control with scale. So R, shift and control, I'm going to scale that in very little bit like that. Let's do it for now to an object and just call it frame. We can name it, but it's going to get absorbed later anyway, frame 1. And by absorbed, I mean it's going to get attached to a mesh and adopt that name. So we have this frame, and we could easily spend a lot of time figuring out how to make spans so that we can bridge this for real, but I don't see the sense in that in this case. Usually, unless this were a hero asset, you're going to see it probably maximum at this distance or further. So what I'm going to do now is just say shell, and I'm going to zero that out. I want to first go out so that I'm getting into the actual body of this window surround, and then come a little in, get some depth, and that looks like what I want. Now the problem here is you can see the corners are a little wonky. As long as you don't have a crazy vert count or weird edging, you can come down here and say straighten corners, and it should fix what you just saw it did. Okay, so what we're going to do is, instead of trying to cut this up and make one contiguous mesh, we're going to make a simple floater, as we did for these sill and the crown, of the frame. So I'm going to go to front viewport, and I'm going to use box. I'm going to look for this horizontal edge, which you can see, and just right below that, I'm going to drag out a box like this. I'm not going to know the dimensions till I get in perspective as far as where it sits and what it looks like. I'm going to move it so it corresponds to the window frame, which it does. And I feel like not bad. Maybe like that's a little better, and sit it within that frame. Okay, so that's just a nice detail separating this arched part from the rest of the window. And now what I'm going to do is just clone that. So shift and drag as a copy. I'm going to rotate it. Turn on your snaps if you don't have your snaps turned on. Mine have angle, I believe, turned on. Oops. Actually, you want angle snap? Yeah, so just I'm clicking on the angle snap. So there we go, 90 degrees. And I'm going to convert this to edit poly. Grab some verts. I'm going to make them so they meet the top and bottom of the window frame, just like that. And that's a nice, like a bifold, almost like a door, which a lot of those old buildings have, like a bifold door. If you want a window that has panes, you could simply grab this piece, and I'm going to go twice. Adjust the spacing by eye just because I'm not being incredibly precise. It's tutorial, so you know, if you have measurements or guides, you can use them. So with that, we have like the beginnings of our frame. And what I want to do now is, this is a good time to think ahead, and you should always be thinking ahead with this workflow, because what you do now will populate everything. We need a pane of glass for this thing, so I'm going to come back to this original frame, not the orange ones here. And the way I'm going to get a pane of glass is collapse this. I'm going to say yes. I'm going to convert that to edit poly because it turned to edit mesh. I'm going to go to polygon. I'm going to control double click on those faces, delete. And now if I come to border and select the inner border, I can say cap. And when I cap, I get a face. So that face right now, I'm going to also detach. I selected it, detach, call it window. And that fills the space. Now, I would say, for me, I'm always, when I'm working, making photoreal renders, or, you know, it's dependent on a lot of things to make it look photoreal. You want your glass to have a realistic depth. So let's just add a shell to that. And I'm going to zero out the values from the last time we used it and say, let's say 0.2. I'm going to use inches. See what we get. It did add that. I'm going to collapse this down, and now we have a window glass that is pretty much perfect for the opening of the arch. And next thing to do is grab the frame, and we're going to just start to, I'm going to use an edit poly and call it combine. You could probably skip some of these steps, but I'm just trying to show you a good workflow. And now I'm going to just attach. So the original frame to all these orange pieces. We now have the frame. And I'm going to temporarily attach the glass. And I say temporarily because when you get some materials later, you're going to want to separate that out and give it its own material. Okay, so there we have that. And just for now, I'm going to combine this and collapse it. It's combined, collapse it down. And now what we're going to do is come to our base. And we have the frame layer. We could do it here. I'm going to just say attach and attach that window frame. And now, if I select the window, hit array, everything has the frame included. Okay, I get a little shading artifact. That's just the viewport. Let me try performance. It's just the way the viewport's reacting, but it's working. Okay, and then I think this is a good thing to note right now too. The sill and the crown have back faces. You can go to the base mesh, and if, you know, because you're making a lot of these, those faces will add up. You can delete that. I'm not going to do it, but like all these faces that are facing into the inside of the building, you can delete and save yourself a hell of a lot of polygons. So it's worth doing. I will not be doing it right now. Okay, so we now have this. And I think now what we need to do is just look at the next level of detail. The example I showed earlier, the image, we can see that like they have these little terracey kind of wrought iron railings, and some of the buildings I looked at before doing this when I was doing R&D, they're pretty close to the window. But that's a nice detail for an old building like this, so that's what we're going to do next, is add something similar to that. I will not be drawing out or making splines for all this crazy stuff. I'm just going to build a basic rectangular with some detail so you can see what will happen. So with that said, if I turn off the array, go to front viewport, I'm just going to go to my splines and drag out a rectangle. And I'm just approximating. I'm not really going crazy as far as worrying about size of these things. I'm going to just F3 so I could see what I'm doing. And I'll say that's fine. Okay. So now we have that. And rather than draw the whole thing out, I'm going to just make a couple circles within that space so that we have some sort of railing detail. Let me hide this window for a second just so we could see a little better. Now we know the scale is in tune with what we're working on. Okay, and I'm not totally worried about perfect just because you can do whatever you want. It's going to be specific to your reference. But all I'm doing is making something in the ballpark of what will work for us. And we'll just move this over. And maybe we'll make a couple smaller circles. I'm just scaling them, cloning them, and placing them. So let's just push this in. I like that. We'll put one over here. We'll grab these two, put them to the bottom. Okay. And now if I go to perspective, you can see I have some gaps, but I'm not worried about it because we're going to attach them all. So I'm going to make this first spline, edit spline. I'm going to just attach and start clicking on these circles, get them all to be part of one mesh. And turn off attach. And the last thing I want to do is make them renderable in the viewport. And here's where you can adjust the size of how thick they are. That's fine. You could also, steps wise, turn up and down the steps. That will add polygons, so be careful. Okay, so that's the railing. I'm going to call it railing, even though it will be part of the window. And it's an edit spline. I'm going to convert it because I'm not going to edit it. I suggest if you make a railing and it's open to art direction that you have a version that is live. So you can collapse one but keep one live. So that's now an edit poly. And if we go back to our window, which is right there, I'm going to move my railing ahead of the window. I'm not making the pieces for the depth. You can figure that out. It's simple enough. Okay, so now we will just come in here, make an edit poly, call that railing. And the reason these are all in the stack is that we can pretty much edit this still. I wouldn't go all the way down to below like the depth, but from sill crown up, you might be able to get away with editing things right now. So just live, it's parametric and it's live, and you can replace stuff. So now we're going to just say with the railing option here, we're going to just say attach. So that modifier, the edit poly modifier attached it. And now if we go to array, every window now has that detail. Okay? So the last thing you would do is, if necessary, you could sew this up. And we'll talk about that in a minute. So we have all this detail. And if you wanted to sew it up, I mean, you could hypothetically make one floor, sew it up, and then just have them meet up top to bottom. That's a decision you're going to make. You could also sew the whole thing up top to bottom, left to right. And the way I would approach it, I'm not going to do it in the video because it's involved, but I think I can explain it simple enough. These edges at the edges of each square for the window, the counts line up and match. So you have 10 here, you have 10 there. You either bridge or collapse those edges or add loops and square them off. And you do that wherever they meet. Now the problem is, like right here, they're overlapping in a way that's not desirable. So that is it's a good way for me to show you right now how we would fix that. So if I go to the building base, the blue mesh, I'm going to just deselect the array. You could simply, actually let's turn array off. You can leave it on. Well, doesn't matter. You can just come across here, and I'm going to just control click all of these. I think I actually, yeah, let's do them all. And you can move them. And that'll update things on the mesh. And then if I deselect, it'll populate everything again. And you can see just that little move. I mean, I got lucky. It came closer than it was before. But if I undo and grab those again, and give them just a slight bit more movement, deselect all the polygons, see where we are now. You can see this is why I said earlier on, some of this stuff needs to be thought out in the beginning, because there's more work. Although it's very editable right now, there's more work if you have to do it later. It's not cumbersome, it's not terrible. And the thing is, we're also getting multiple buildings out of this one thing. So we can add a floor. I don't know if I've shown this. Let me just show this really quickly. If I go to the blue mesh, hold down shift and drag up, as long as I get close to the scale that I need, as far as tiling top to bottom, we'll have a new floor. I went a little too far, but you can see that, you know, it's parametric in that manner. I'm going to undo that. The other thing too, I have a symmetry modifier on this. Let me just turn that on really quick so you can see. You know, we have two buildings, right? But I also have this turret. And this turret, I made a cylinder, deleted top and bottom faces. Separate of this mesh, the blue mesh, I did an array of this window to this and found that I needed to scale this up into, you know, the width, so not the height, to get the windows to match up. So I did that interactively, did that earlier, I'm not going to do it now. And now if I were to come here and put an edit poly and just attach that turret, go to polygon, deselect, we now have another interesting detail. And we can also come back up, turn on symmetry, and we get the courtyard building with, you know, like needs a little adjustment, but you know, there's a courtyard here and a left and right side. So you could see this is powerful stuff. Okay, so I'm going to turn off symmetry. I'll leave the edit poly on for now. And the next thing I want to show is when I did the intro, I had shown that you can actually do some interesting things as far as making multiple buildings. So I'm going to turn the array off on this mesh. And then I believe I have an optional window. So I'm going to just turn on this old layer briefly. And let's see. It's on the building right there. Okay. So let me get rid of this one here. We don't need it. This mesh is something I built based off of an earlier, let me get rid of that too. These are from the intro, earlier version of this. So all I did was take something that was similar to this mesh, use symmetry to make it the square edge be on the top. I deleted the railing, made sure it matched the spacing. That's what this is, just a variation of another version of this. And I put an array on this, and because it fits within that square, it's subject to the same activity. So turn on array, and you can see if I hide the building, there we go. We have all that detail. Again, a couple spots you'd need to clean up a little, but think of the power of this. We made two variations on a building. Honestly, making the arch window into the square one was a minute of work. And you could effectively, like if you've ever seen the Empire State Building, it has different tiers where they step inward. You could make a tier with the round windows, inset the mesh a little bit, make a tier with the square windows. It's just really powerful. I think it shows the power of the modifier. It shows how to work smart. And it's a really good approach to doing something like this. So I think we're just about done, but I'm going to close it up in a minute. Okay, so this base, you can always adjust these edges to break the gaps down. This is the last thing we're going to talk about right now. I have this edit poly. I'm going to add one more. And it's just to show how you can make some adjustments if needed. So I just did a loop selection. I'm doing this live. Depending on the power of your machine, you can do it if you like. It helps to see it. Or you can just do it incrementally and toggle the array on the window mesh on and off. I'm just going to move this forward along the Y. And you can see that closed the gap at the front end here. I'm going to do the next edge selection and just pull that forward as well. You can see it's interactively changing the spacing of those meshes, and that's what we want. So this is the quick way, just so you know, to edit this to make the gaps disappear. There could be instances where you're looking at this far and you don't need to actually sew it up, and you can just take this, collapse it, throw some UVs on it, and texture it. So let's assume you have that all done. The last thing you would do is make one-off details if you needed to. So maybe the building would have a ground layer below these 4 floors that has an entryway door or some storefronts, whatever. You would build that separate, make it match up, and that would be the last of the detail. Maybe some crowns like along the roof. The roof line, it has a flat roof. You could put a nice coping detail if you wanted to. And then you have a finished asset and still editable. And also you could, as I said earlier, like these details of like the crown and the sill, you can sculpt them away, decimate them in ZBrush, or boolean them together in here and crunch them down as far as poly count. Remove these, add the new ones, and you'd have more detail in your building. So it's very, very powerful. If you do collapse it, I always say have a file with a version where it's not collapsed, and even I would probably make a layer of the live version and have a collapsed version as well, just to play it safe. And that's it. So I think I've shown the power of this. It doesn't only need to be done for buildings. You can adapt this technique to anything you like. And I hope you found this helpful. Again, I haven't been repetitive with the content. This is my 4th tutorial. It's not the same as my 3rd, 2nd, or 1st. It's different content each time. I think it's quality content. I hope you find it helpful. If you do, please like and subscribe below. And we'll continue to make people, places, and things in CG and expand our horizons. Thanks so much. I'm Todd Daniele.